I told the executive chef to shove his fish up his ass. Trialing at the Bastion was the holy grail for a line cook. Chef Arthur Vance was a legend in the culinary world, but he was also known for being a complete nightmare. He frequently fired entire kitchen brigades on a whim. He once threw a scorching hot sauté pan at a commis chef because the kid sneezed near the pass. Now he was opening a new flagship restaurant right in the middle of the city. 60 seats, open kitchen, $2 million just in custom stainless steel and copper. He needed an executive sous chef to run it. Out of hundreds of applicants, it came down to 2 of us. The trial was supposed to last 3 days. Vance lined Julian and me up in the pristine kitchen on Monday morning. The place smelled like bleach, ozone from the air purifiers, and fresh paint. Julian was one of those guys who looked like he belonged on a magazine cover. Perfect hair, pristine white chef coat, and a custom leather knife roll that cost more than my car. I was running on 4 hours of sleep and cheap diner coffee. Vance stood in front of us. He didn't say hello. He didn't shake our hands. He just told us only one of us would walk out with a contract. He said the next 72 hours would break us. The first day was a sabotage test. We didn't know it was a sabotage test until the clock started. Vance told us to prepare our signature dishes for a mock lunch service. We had 1 hour to prep and plate. He pointed to the massive walk-in fridge at the back of the kitchen and hit a stopwatch. When the timer started, Julian sprinted. He literally threw his shoulder into my chest, shoved me out of the way, and ripped the heavy metal door open. By the time I recovered and got inside, the shelves were practically bare. Vance had deliberately understocked the cooler. Julian was standing there with his arms full. He grabbed literally all the butter, the fresh thyme, the rosemary, and every single premium cut of Wagyu beef. He took the only bottle of decent heavy cream. By the time I got to the produce racks, all that was left was a mesh bag of bruised tomatoes, a half-empty flat of stale sourdough bread, and a plastic-wrapped log of cheap, pale ground pork. I stood there in the freezing air for 10 seconds. I could have walked out. I could have complained to Vance that Julian played dirty, but I knew exactly what this was. It was a test to see if I'd whine. So, I grabbed my garbage ingredients and walked back to my station. Julian was already searing his Wagyu. The smell of melting fat and butter was filling the kitchen. I looked at my station. The tomatoes were soft and rotting on one side. The bread was hard as a rock. The pork was wet and commercial grade. I cut the rot off the tomatoes and tossed them in a blistering hot cast iron pan to blister the skins and force out whatever flavor was left. I rendered the fat out of that cheap pork, throwing away the gray water that seeped out until I just had crispy bits and grease. I used that grease to fry the stale bread. I drowned the whole thing in garlic and chicken stock from the lowboy. I made a massive batch of rustic Tuscan bread soup, ribollita. When time was up, Vance walked over to the pass. He tasted Julian's dish first. Julian had made a perfect Wagyu filet with a red wine reduction and a potato fondant. Vance chewed it slowly, nodded, and praised him for a perfect medium rare. Then he walked over to my station. He looked at the massive metal bowl of thick red soup. He took 1 spoonful. He rolled it around in his mouth, swallowed, and laughed. A short, sharp sound. He told me I was cooking peasant food for a Michelin-starred dining room. He said if he wanted slop, he would go to a soup kitchen. I just nodded. I said, "Yes, chef," and took the criticism. I didn't defend the dish. I knew I was probably going to lose right then and there. But I also knew I had 3 gallons of perfectly good hot food. The prep cooks and the dishwashers were lingering near the back of the kitchen. They had been scrubbing floors since 4 in the morning. They looked exhausted. So after Vance walked away, I grabbed a stack of deli containers, portioned out the rest of the soup, and fed the dishwashing crew before we went home. Julian spent the time polishing his knives. Day 2 was about pressure. If day 1 was a joke, day 2 was a meat grinder. Vance put us on the line during the dinner rush. The restaurant was doing a soft opening for investors and VIPs. 300 covers in 4 hours, and Vance intentionally caused chaos. He was standing at the pass reading out tickets, but he was mumbling. When we asked him to repeat the calls, he ignored us. He walked down the line and purposely hid my squeeze bottles of finishing oils. He changed the table numbers on the tickets halfway through the firing process. Every time I turned around to grab a hot pan, he was standing right behind me, bumping into my elbow while I was plating delicate microgreens. It was 110 degrees on the line. Sweat was stinging my eyes. The ticket printer was making that relentless ch sound that haunts cooks in their sleep. Julian cracked first. We were 2 hours into the rush. We were weeded. Julian was working the meat station, and a young waitress came pushing through the swinging doors. She was maybe 19, terrified, holding a plate with a half-eaten New York strip. She walked up to the pass and stuttered out that table 4 wanted their steak cooked longer. They ordered it medium, but thought it was too pink. Julian lost his mind. He grabbed the plate out of her hand and slammed it down on the steel counter so hard I thought the ceramic was going to shatter. He leaned over the counter and started screaming at her. Saliva was flying out of his mouth. He called her stupid. He told her she was a useless idiot who couldn't manage a simple order. He screamed so loud the entire kitchen stopped moving. The waitress looked like she was going to cry. She just backed away and practically ran out of the kitchen. I was drowning in my own tickets. I had 6 pans of fish on the stove and 3 risottos going at once, but I just kept my head down. You don't get involved in someone else's meltdown. A minute later, the ticket printer jammed. The paper roll got caught and started folding in on itself, stopping the flow of orders. The expo cook started panicking. I pulled my pans off the direct heat. I wiped my hands on my apron, walked over to the machine, popped the plastic cover, and fixed the paper roll. I pulled the jammed tickets out, lined them up on the rail, and apologized to the waitstaff standing there for the delay. Then I went back to my station and pushed my pans back onto the heat. Vance pulled me into his office after service. The smell of old coffee and wet shoes was heavy in the small room. He didn't offer me a chair. He leaned back against his desk and looked at me like I was a cockroach he found in the flower bin. He told me I lacked the killer instinct to run a brigade. He said I spent too much time apologizing and fixing paper jams when I should have been driving the line. He said I was too soft, that I cared too much about feelings, and that this kitchen would eat me alive before the first health inspection. I looked him dead in the eye. I told him screaming at teenagers does not make the food cook faster. Vance stopped. He stared at me for a long time. He didn't yell. He just picked up his clipboard, wrote something down with a black pen, and told me to get out. By the morning of the third day, I knew I was going to fail. You don't talk back to Arthur Vance and get a job. I was running on fumes. My feet felt like they were bleeding inside my boots. I had a burn on my forearm from a grease splatter that was stinging like crazy. I was just trying to survive until the end of the shift so I could get my knives and go sleep for 2 days. At 10 in the morning, Vance called Julian and me to the main prep tables. 2 delivery guys wheeled in a massive cooler. They opened it up and hauled out a 300-pound bluefin tuna. It was a monster. The skin was dark and metallic, slick with melting ice. It smelled faintly of the deep ocean. It was worth thousands of dollars, maybe 10 grand depending on the market. Vance gave us each a specialized breaking knife. He pointed to the fish. He gave us each a section top loin for me, belly for Julian. He told us the first person to perfectly break down and portion their cut into exact 6-ounce blocks with 0 waste would be his new sous chef. This was it. Pure, technical skill under a microscope. We grabbed our knives and started working. The kitchen was dead silent. The prep cooks had stopped chopping. Even the dishwashers had turned off the sprayers. The only sound in the entire room was the wet slide of steel slicing through dense, cold muscle and the heavy thud of the knives hitting the thick plastic cutting boards. I was focused. The meat was beautiful, deep red and marbled with fat. I was making my third slice, separating the bloodline from the usable meat. Right in the middle of the butcher test, a young dishwasher named Mateo came walking out of the back room carrying a stack of large ceramic dinner plates. He was 18, a kid from Guatemala who worked 2 jobs to send money home. Someone had spilled a quart of fryer oil near the 3-compartment sink and hadn't thrown salt on it. Mateo's rubber boot hit the grease. His legs shot out from under him. He went down hard. It wasn't a normal fall. He didn't just land on his back. He twisted, trying to save the plates, and crashed straight into a metal metro rack holding even more of the custom Japanese ceramic ware. The heavy metal rack tipped forward. Hundreds of plates cascaded down, shattering against the hard tile floor. Mateo landed right in the middle of the debris. He let out this horrible, ragged scream. It echoed off the stainless steel walls. I looked over. Mateo was sitting up, staring at his left forearm. There was a massive, jagged piece of white ceramic embedded deep in his skin, right near the crook of his elbow. He pulled it out, which you're never supposed to do, and the blood didn't just drip. It sprayed. It was bright red arterial blood, and it was pooling on the white floor tiles incredibly fast. The kid started hyperventilating. His eyes went wide and unfocused. I looked at Julian. Julian was standing 10 feet away from Mateo. He had a clear view. He looked at the kid. He looked at the blood. And then he looked back at his tuna. He didn't even pause. He adjusted his grip on his knife and kept slicing, perfectly focused on finishing the test. At one point, the puddle of blood started creeping toward his boots. Julian actually took a half step to the right, stepping around the blood to grab a clean tray for his fish. I dropped my knife immediately. It clattered against the metal table. I didn't think about the test. I didn't think about Vance. I grabbed a thick stack of clean, dry bar towels from the shelf above my station. I sprinted across the kitchen, sliding a little on the wet floor, and dropped to my knees right in the shattered ceramic. I grabbed Mateo's arm. It was incredibly warm. I pressed the entire stack of towels directly against the wound and leaned all my body weight into it to stop the bleeding. The white towels soaked through instantly, turning a dark, heavy crimson. Mateo was crying, his head falling back against the metal leg of the sink. "Hey, look at me!" I shouted at him. "Mateo, look at me! Breathe!" I turned my head and yelled at one of the terrified prep cooks who was just standing there frozen. "Call an ambulance! Right fucking now! Tell them arterial bleeding!" The cook snapped out of it and ran for the office phone. Vance stormed out of his glass-walled office. He had heard the crash. He came out screaming his head off, completely unhinged. He ignored the broken plates. He ignored Mateo on the floor. He walked right up to my prep table, looked at my abandoned knife and the half-butchered tuna, and then looked down at me on the floor. He demanded to know why I abandoned a $10,000 fish in the middle of a final test. He pointed at the meat sitting on the board. He told me the ambient heat of the kitchen was ruining the texture. He said I was disrespecting the ingredient. He told me to get back to my station right now or I was done. I felt the heat rise up in my chest. I looked down at my hands, covered in a teenager's blood. I felt Mateo shaking under my grip. I looked up at Arthur Vance, the culinary god, the man who held my entire career in his hands. I lost my temper completely. I looked right at him and told him he could shove the fish up his ass because a kid was bleeding out on his floor. The entire kitchen went completely silent. The hum of the refrigerators suddenly sounded incredibly loud. No one moved. No one breathed. Julian, standing at his prep table, smirked. I saw it out of the corner of my eye. He carefully placed his last piece of perfectly portioned tuna onto his tray, wiped his knife on a towel, and looked at me. He clearly thought he had just won the job. He had followed the rules. He had shown the killer instinct. The paramedics arrived 3 minutes later. They came bursting through the back alley doors with a heavy trauma bag. I kept the pressure on until the medic kneeled down next to me and took over with a combat tourniquet and thick gauze. They strapped Mateo to a portable stretcher. The kid was pale and shivering, but he was alive. They wheeled him out the back doors, the red lights from the ambulance, flashing against the brick walls of the alley. Once they were gone, the kitchen felt empty. There was just a massive pool of blood and shattered plates on the floor. I stood up. My knees were sore from the tile. My apron was ruined. My hands were stained dark red. I didn't even wait for Vance to say anything. I didn't look at Julian. I walked over to the hand-washing sink. I turned the water on as hot as it would go. I grabbed the heavy-duty pumice soap and scrubbed my hands and forearms until the water running down the drain turned from pink back to clear. I dried my hands. I walked over to my station. I picked up my knife. I washed the blade, dried it carefully, and slid the plastic guard over the edge. I unrolled my leather bag and started packing up my tools. My chef's knife, my paring knife, my honing rod. I zipped the bag shut. I took off my apron and threw it in the linen bin. I knew I was done. You don't tell the owner to shove it and stick around for a handshake. I walked down the long hallway toward the back exit. The heavy metal door was propped open. The cool afternoon air felt incredible against my face. I stepped out onto the concrete loading dock. The smell of the dumpsters and city exhaust was comforting. It was real. I was walking down the ramp toward the alley when I heard the heavy door swing open again. I heard Vance call my last name. I stopped. I didn't want to turn around. I figured he was coming out to yell at me one last time, to make sure I knew I was blacklisted in this city. I turned around. Vance was standing on the edge of the loading dock. He wasn't yelling. The crazy, manic energy from the kitchen was completely gone. He looked tired. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a pack of cigarettes, tapped one out, and lit it. He took a long drag and let the smoke drift up into the alley. He looked at me. He said anyone can slice a piece of fish. Anyone can follow a recipe, memorize a technique, and scream at a waitress when the pressure gets too high. He took another drag. He said a kitchen is a pressure cooker. It's a dangerous place. Knives, fire, boiling oil, slick floors. When things go wrong, and they always go wrong, people either panic, they freeze, or they step up. He looked back toward the open door of the kitchen. He said he didn't need a culinary genius who would step over a bleeding kid for a promotion. He said a guy like that would sell out his own crew the second the ship started taking on water. He needed someone who would keep his people alive, someone who fed the dishwashers when they were tired, someone who fixed the printer instead of screaming about it. He dropped the cigarette on the concrete and crushed it out with his boot. He told Julian to pack his bags and get off his property immediately. Then he reached into his pocket, pulled out a heavy ring of brass keys, and threw them to me. I caught them in one hand. They were the keys to the restaurant. I caught the keys. They were heavy brass, 4 of them on a cheap wire ring. They felt cold against my palm, which was still raw from the heavy-duty pumice soap. I stood there on the loading dock looking at them. Vance didn't wait for a thank you. He didn't wait for a handshake. He just turned and walked back inside, the heavy metal door slamming shut behind him. I took a deep breath. The city air tasted like diesel exhaust and damp concrete. It tasted real. I looked at my hands. There was still a faint pink stain around my cuticles from the blood. I pushed the heavy metal door open and followed him in. The kitchen was still a disaster zone. The blood had coagulated into a dark, sticky pool on the white tiles. The shattered plates were still scattered everywhere. Julian was standing at his station. He had his custom leather knife roll open on the stainless steel counter. He was wiping down his perfectly clean slicing blade one more time. He looked up when I walked in. He saw the keys in my hand. His jaw tightened. He didn't say a word, but his face went red. A dark, ugly flush starting at his collar and creeping up his neck. "Get your shit and get out," Vance said. He was leaning against the pass, drinking a glass of ice water. "I want you off the property in 2 minutes." Julian slammed his knife roll shut. He zipped it up so hard I thought the heavy brass track would break. He picked up his bag, threw it over his shoulder, and walked right past me. He deliberately dropped his shoulder and bumped mine hard as he went by. A cheap, desperate shot. I didn't even flinch. I just watched him walk out the back door into the alley. The kitchen felt instantly lighter the second the door clicked shut behind him. The rest of the crew was still standing around the edges of the room. The prep cooks, the remaining dishwashers, they were staring at me. They had just seen me tell the legendary owner to shove his fish up his ass. Now I was standing there holding the keys to his $2 million restaurant. I didn't give a speech. I didn't announce myself as the new executive sous chef. I walked over to the janitor's closet. I filled a yellow mop bucket with scalding hot water and industrial degreaser. I grabbed a push broom and a heavy plastic dustpan. I walked over to the puddle of blood and grease and started sweeping up the broken ceramic. After about 10 seconds, the lead prep cook grabbed a mop. Then a dishwasher grabbed a bucket and a coarse sponge. We cleaned the floor together in total silence. Vance just watched us from the pass, finishing his water, before walking into his office and shutting the glass door. The next month was the hardest 30 days of my life. Building a menu with Vance was like negotiating a hostage release. He fought me on every ingredient, every technique, every plating decision. He was still a nightmare. He still yelled when a beurre blanc separated. He still threw entire sheet pans of prep directly into the garbage if the diced onions weren't perfectly uniform. But he never once threatened to fire me. The dynamic had shifted. He pushed me to the absolute limit of my physical and culinary ability, but he stopped messing with the line. The sabotage was over. We were building a restaurant. I visited Mateo in the hospital the day after the trial. He had 32 stitches running down his left forearm. The jagged ceramic had missed the main artery by 3 millimeters. The doctor told him if he had been left on the floor for even a minute longer, he would have bled out. I brought him a massive plastic container of the Tuscan bread soup. He was too doped up on painkillers to eat it, but his mother cried when I handed it to her in the waiting room. I told her his job was waiting for him the second he got his cast off. Opening night was a Tuesday. It was pouring cold rain outside. We had a fully booked dining room, 60 seats, turning 3 times, 180 covers. The primary investors were at table 1. The city's biggest food critic was sitting by the window at table 4. The kitchen hit 90 degrees before the first ticket even printed. At exactly 5:30, the machine made that sound. Tsh, then another, then 5 more. The rail filled up in 60 seconds. The rush hit us like a freight train. I stood at the pass. I was the one calling the tickets now. Vance was standing directly behind me, his arms crossed over his pristine white chef coat, just watching. He was letting me swim or drown. "Fire table 1, I called out. My voice cut completely through the noise of the massive exhaust hoods. 2 Wagyu, medium rare, 1 halibut, 1 mushroom risotto. "Yes, chef!" the line yelled back in perfect unison. It wasn't a scared, hesitant yell. It was loud, tight, and focused. 2 hours into service, we got weeded. The grill station got backed up on a massive party order. We were down 2 pans of the veal demi-glace. A new line cook, a kid barely out of culinary school, panicked. He turned too fast, holding a tray of garnished appetizers, and dropped the whole thing. 6 plates hit the floor. The crash sounded exactly like Mateo's fall. The entire kitchen flinched. Everything stopped for half a second. The line cook froze, his eyes wide, terrified that Vance was going to start throwing cast iron pans at his head. Vance uncrossed his arms. He took a sharp breath, stepping forward, getting ready to rip the kid apart. I stepped backward, putting myself physically between Vance and the line cook. I looked right at the kid. "You good?" I asked. He nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes, chef. Grab a broom. Clean it up. Refire table 6 on the fly. You have 3 minutes." "Yes, chef?" The kid moved. The line kept pushing. I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. We fixed the problem and moved on. I felt Vance staring at the back of my neck. He didn't say a word. He stepped back and let me run my brigade. By midnight, the last ticket was cleared. The dining room was empty. The kitchen smelled like burned sugar, roasted garlic, and exhausted human bodies. Every single one of us was soaked in sweat. Our feet were throbbing. My hands were covered in small, fresh burns. But the ticket rail was completely clear. We had pushed through nearly 200 covers without a single plate sent back to the kitchen. The dishwashers were spraying down the heavy rubber floor mats in the back. The line cooks were scrubbing the stainless steel prep counters with coarse steel wool. I was standing at the pass, wiping down the metal rail with a damp towel. Vance walked out of his office. He had a bottle of cheap domestic beer in his hand. He didn't offer me one. He just leaned against the steel counter next to me. "The halibut at table 4 was slightly overcooked," he said. His voice was completely flat. I kept wiping the rail. By 30 seconds. "I know. The pan was too hot. It won't happen tomorrow." He took a slow drink of his beer. He looked out at the empty, spotless kitchen. He looked at the line cooks scrubbing the stoves, dead tired but joking with each other over the sound of the running water. No one was screaming. No one was crying in the walk-in cooler. He looked at me. "You run a soft kitchen," he said. I stopped wiping the counter. I threw my dirty rag into the linen bin. I turned and looked directly at Chef Arthur Vance. "Yeah?" I said. "And we didn't drop a single ticket." Vance didn't say anything else. He just stared at me for a long time, the ambient noise of the dish pit echoing behind us. Then he nodded, just once. He turned around, walked back into his office, and shut the door. I turned off the main overhead lights, grabbed my keys, and locked up for the night. 6 months later, the honeymoon was completely dead. The Bastion wasn't just a restaurant anymore. It was a machine, and it was running us into the ground. We were booked out 4 months in advance. We were turning over $100,000 a week in food alone. The pressure didn't come from Vance anymore. It came from the sheer, crushing weight of expectations. When people wait 4 months and pay $400 a head for a tasting menu, they don't want a good meal. They want a religious experience. The physical toll was getting ridiculous. I was sleeping on an air mattress in my office 3 nights a week because it didn't make sense to drive home at 2 in the morning just to be back for prep at 6. My hands looked like they belonged to a 60-year-old mechanic. Burn scars mapped my forearms. I had a permanent, dull ache in my lower back that hummed like a refrigerator compressor. Mateo was back. The hospital had cleared him after 8 weeks. He had a thick, raised pink scar running down his arm, but the nerve damage was minimal. I didn't put him back in the dish pit. I moved him to the prep tables. I taught him knife skills, starting with bags of cheap onions and moving him up to peeling crates of fingerling potatoes. He was quiet, fast, and completely loyal. Vance was changing. The quiet respect he showed me after opening night had started to curdle into something else as the rumors of the Michelin Guide releasing its new list began to circulate. The stakes were getting to him. The old Vance, the tyrant who threw pans and screamed at waitstaff, was trying to claw his way out of the box I had forced him into. He started drinking heavily in his office during service. He wouldn't come out onto the line, but he would stand behind the glass watching us, his face tight and flushed. It broke open on a Friday night in late July. There was a massive heat wave blanketing the city. The asphalt outside was soft. Inside the kitchen, the ambient temperature was hovering around 115 degrees. The air conditioning in the dining room was struggling. On the line, we were drinking quarts of ice water mixed with salt and lemon juice just to keep from passing out. At exactly 7:30, right in the absolute teeth of the dinner rush, the main exhaust hood system died. It didn't sputter. It didn't make a grinding noise. The massive intake fan on the roof just seized up. The low, heavy rumble that had been the background noise of my life for 6 months suddenly stopped. The silence lasted for about 2 seconds before the panic set in. Without the hoods, a commercial kitchen with 8 open gas burners, a wood-fired grill, and 4 double-stack ovens turns into a gas chamber instantly. Within 30 seconds, a thick, acrid cloud of white oak smoke from the grill and atomized grease from the sauté pans hit the ceiling and started rolling down the walls. It smelled like burning plastic and charred meat. My eyes immediately started watering. I couldn't see the far end of the line. "Turn on the backups!" I yelled, coughing as the smoke hit the back of my throat. "I tried," my grill cook shouted back. He was waving a towel frantically at the smoke. "The breaker is tripped. The whole circuit is dead." The ticket printer was still churning out orders. Shh. The dining room didn't know what was happening yet. They were out there sipping chilled Chablis, waiting for their sweetbreads and venison. The heat spiked. Without the exhaust pulling the hot air out, the temperature on the line shot past 120. It was suffocating. I saw the young line cook from opening night sway on his feet, his face completely pale under the sweat. Vance burst out of his office. He had a half-empty glass of bourbon in his hand. He looked up at the ceiling, saw the smoke banking down, and his eyes went wide. The old panic, the old rage, took over instantly. "Keep cooking," he screamed. "Don't stop the pans. Push the food out. We are not dropping service because of a fucking fan." I looked at him. He was completely unhinged. The smoke was dropping lower. It was at our shoulders now. We were breathing in pure grease and carbon monoxide. It wasn't just uncomfortable. It was dangerous. "Chef, we have no ventilation," I said, coughing into my sleeve. "We have to kill the gas. If we keep the wood grill burning, someone is going to pass out in 3 minutes." Vance walked right up to the pass. The veins in his neck were bulging. He slammed his glass down on the steel rail. It shattered, sending cheap bourbon and ice flying everywhere. I said, "Keep cooking. The VIP table is waiting on their mains. Do not touch those valves or you are all fired. Every single one of you." The line cooks froze. They looked at me. They were coughing, wiping tears from their eyes, terrified of Vance but physically unable to breathe. Mateo was standing at his prep station, clutching a bunch of basil, staring at the smoke. I looked at the ticket rail. I looked at the VIP orders. I looked at the $2 million of stainless steel around me. Then I reached under the pass and grabbed the heavy red lever for the emergency gas shutoff. "Hey!" Vance screamed, lunging across the counter. "Don't you fucking touch that!" I yanked the lever down. A loud hiss echoed through the kitchen as the main gas line severed. The 8 open burners on the stove clicked and died. The roar of the gas ovens vanished. The only thing left burning was the wood on the grill, but the immediate source of the extreme heat and gas was gone. "Everyone off the line!" I shouted over Vance's screaming. "Get into the walk-in, now! Grab your water and get into the cooler. Move!" The cooks didn't hesitate. They dropped their tongs and sprinted for the heavy metal door of the walk-in fridge. They piled inside, coughing and gasping for the 50-degree air. Vance was standing in the middle of the smoke, his face purple. He looked like he was going to have a heart attack. He grabbed a raw steak off the counter and threw it at the wall. "You just killed my restaurant," he roared. "You just cost me $30,000. You're done. You hear me? You're completely done." I didn't yell back. I walked over to the fire extinguisher, pulled the pin, and hit the wood grill with a short blast of dry chemical. The white powder smothered the white oak instantly. The smoke stopped generating. The kitchen was dead. The silence was heavier than the smoke. I walked back over to the pass. I wiped the bourbon off my arm. "No," I said, my voice quiet. "I just saved you from a massive lawsuit. I saved you from an ambulance pulling up to the front doors of your flagship restaurant while the Michelin inspectors are supposedly in town." Vance stopped screaming. He was breathing hard, staring at me through the haze. "You think they give out stars to kitchens that send their cooks to the hospital with carbon monoxide poisoning?" I asked. "You think you're a god because your name is on the door. You're a liability. You're a drunk liability who panics when the pressure actually hits." He stared at me. No one had spoken to him like that in 20 years. The smoke was slowly drifting out through the open back door. The dining room manager poked his head through the swinging doors, saw the smoke, and his eyes widened. "Chef?" the manager asked, terrified. "The dining room is starting to smell smoke. What do I tell them?" I didn't look at Vance. I looked at the manager. "Tell them the main exhaust failed. It's a safety hazard. Comp all the drinks. Comp all the appetizers that went out. Apologize profusely. Get them out the door. We're closed for the night." The manager looked at Vance for confirmation. Vance just stood there, his shoulders slumped. He looked old. He looked completely defeated. He waved his hand at the manager, a weak, dismissive gesture, and turned away. I walked back to the walk-in cooler and pulled the heavy door open. My crew was sitting on milk crates and stacked bags of onions, shivering in the cold, their faces streaked with soot and sweat. They looked up at me. "Grab your knives," I said. "Clean your stations. We're going home early." Mateo stood up. He walked past me, pulling his apron off over his head. As he went by, he bumped my shoulder. It wasn't a hard, angry shove like Julian's. It was quiet. It was solid. Vance was gone when we finally locked up. His office was dark. He hadn't said a word to me since the gas shut off. We didn't lose a single cook that night. They all came back the next morning. The HVAC guys fixed the hood motor by noon. We prepped in silence, the rhythm of the knives hitting the boards replacing the chaos of the night before. Vance didn't come in until 3 in the afternoon. He walked straight into his office, shut the door, and didn't come out for service. He never threw another pan. He never screamed on the line again. 3 months later, the guide came out. The Bastion got 2 stars. It was exactly what Vance had wanted his entire life. When the call came in, he didn't celebrate. He just walked out onto the line, looked at the crew, and nodded. Then he looked at me, handed me the clipboard with the night's reservations, and walked out the back door to smoke. I took the clipboard. I looked at the ticket rail. I called the first order. The machine kept running. The 2 stars changed everything and nothing. The food got tighter. The reservations got harder to get. The linen delivery guy started treating us like we were royalty, but the burn still hurt exactly the same. The floor mats were still heavy and wet at 2 a.m, and Arthur Vance was still a ghost haunting his own restaurant. For a year, it worked. We were a pirate ship flying a corporate flag. I ran the brigade, I hired, I fired, I designed the seasonal menus. Vance sat in his office, drank expensive Japanese whiskey, and did interviews with food magazines about his culinary vision. I let him. It kept him off my line. It kept my cooks safe. Then the investors got greedy. It started quietly in the third quarter of our second year. The restaurant was pulling in massive numbers, but fine dining is a terrible business model. The margins are razor thin. When you have a dedicated prep cook whose only job is to turn tourne potatoes and micro-dice shallots, your labor costs eat your profits alive. They called a meeting on a Monday morning, our only dark day. The restaurant was empty, smelling faintly of floor wax and stale wine. I was in the kitchen doing inventory, counting vacuum-sealed bags of duck breast in the walk-in, when Vance's manager told me I was needed in the private dining room. I walked in wearing a t-shirt and work boots. There were 3 men sitting around the custom mahogany table. I recognized Richard, the lead investor. He was a real estate guy who treated restaurants like vanity projects. He was wearing a suit that cost more than my entire kitchen staff made in a week. Vance was sitting at the head of the table. He looked hungover. His eyes were red and the skin under them was puffy and dark. Richard didn't offer me a seat. He just slid a manila folder across the polished wood. He told me the numbers were unacceptable. He said the 2 Michelin stars had maximized our marketing potential, but the return on investment wasn't matching the gross revenue. He used words like optimization and streamlining. I opened the folder. It was a spreadsheet breaking down my kitchen by the hour, by the dollar, by the ounce. Richard pointed a manicured finger at the paper. He told me we were cutting our prep team by 50%. He said we were switching our meat purveyor to a massive commercial distributor that offered a 30% discount on bulk orders. He said we were going to start buying pre-peeled garlic, pre-portioned fish fillets, and frozen stock bases. I stared at the spreadsheet. It was a death warrant. Pre-portioned fish, I said. My voice was completely flat. In a 2-star Michelin kitchen. The guests won't know the difference, Richard said, leaning back in his leather chair. You cover it in that expensive sauce you make. It's a business. Right now, your labor and food costs are running at 38%. I want them at 28%, by next month. I looked at Vance. He was staring at his hands. He wasn't defending the food. He wasn't defending the stars he had built his entire identity around. He was just sitting there, a hollow shell of a chef, letting a real estate developer butcher his menu. If we cut the prep team by half, I said, looking back at Richard, who does the butchery? Who makes the fresh pasta? Who clarifies the consommé? You figure it out, Richard said. You're the executive sous chef, or you buy it pre-made. I don't care, but the names on page 3 need to be let go by Friday. I flipped to page 3. It was a list of my staff, the guys who had scrubbed the floors, the kids who had sweat through the heat wave. Right at the top of the list was Mateo. He made $18 an hour. He was the most reliable prep cook I had. He could break down a crate of artichokes faster than anyone in the city. He sent 80% of his paycheck back to Guatemala. I closed the folder. I didn't throw it. I just slid it back across the mahogany table until it stopped perfectly in front of Richard. No, I said. Richard stopped smiling. He sat up. Excuse me? I said no. I'm not firing my prep team. I'm not buying frozen stock. And I'm definitely not buying pre-cut, vacuum-sealed commercial fish so you can shave 10 points off your bottom line. You want to run a TGI Fridays, go buy one. This is the Bastion. Richard looked at Vance. Arthur, talk to your employee. Vance finally looked up. He looked exhausted. He looked right at me, and there was absolutely nothing behind his eyes. No fire, no pride. Just do it, Vance said. His voice was a rasp. Make the cuts, adjust the menu. We need to keep the board happy. I stood there in the quiet, air-conditioned room. I thought about the first day I walked into this kitchen. I thought about the 300-pound bluefin tuna. I thought about Vance telling me he needed someone to keep his crew alive. He didn't mean it. He never meant it. He just meant he needed someone to do the dirty work so he didn't have to look at the blood. You're a coward, I told him. The word dropped into the room like a brick. Richard opened his mouth to speak, but I cut him off. You want to optimize? I looked at Richard. Fire him. I pointed at Vance. He hasn't cooked a service in 14 months. He draws a $250,000 salary to drink your liquor and read his own press clippings. You cut him. You hit your margins today. Leave my line cooks alone. Vance stood up. The chair scraped violently against the hardwood floor. His face was purple. The ghost was gone. The tyrant was back. You arrogant little shit, Vance spat, slamming his hands on the table. I made you. You were nothing. You were making peasant soup out of garbage when I found you. I gave you those keys. I gave you this kitchen. You work for me. I work for the food, I said. And I work for the crew. You work for a spreadsheet. I reached into my pocket. I pulled out the heavy brass ring with the 4 keys. The keys to the front door, the office, the walk-in, and the dry storage. They clinked together in the quiet room. I didn't throw them at him. I didn't slam them on the table for dramatic effect. I just set them down quietly on top of the manila folder. You want to serve frozen fish? I said. You can cook it yourself. I turned around and walked out of the private dining room. I didn't look back. I walked through the swinging doors into the main kitchen. It was dark, quiet, and perfectly clean. The stainless steel reflected the emergency exit lights. I walked back to my locker. I pulled out my custom leather knife roll, the one I bought with my first bonus check after we got the stars. I packed my chef's knife, my paring knife, my honing rod. I zipped it shut. I walked out the back door, down the concrete loading dock, and out into the alley. I didn't have a plan. I didn't have savings. I had $20 in my wallet and a resume that essentially said I was the guy who ran Arthur Vance's kitchen while he drank himself to death. My phone started ringing before I even hit the subway. It was the dining room manager. I ignored it. 10 minutes later, it rang again. My lead line cook. I ignored it. I went home, threw my knife roll on the kitchen table, and slept for 14 straight hours. When I woke up on Tuesday, the industry news had already broken. Executive sous chef walk out at 2-star Bastion. The rumors were flying. I got out of bed, drank a glass of tap water, and looked at my phone. I had 42 missed calls. One of them was from a number I didn't recognize, a local area code. I listened to the voicemail. It was Julian. He didn't sound arrogant. He sounded completely different than the guy who had bumped my shoulder on his way out 2 years ago. He asked me to meet him at a dive bar in the warehouse district at noon. I didn't have anything else to do. I put on a clean shirt and went. The bar smelled like old beer and bleach. It was pitch black inside despite the midday sun. Julian was sitting in a booth in the back. He looked tired. He didn't have the pristine white chef coat anymore. He was wearing a faded gray t-shirt. He had a scar over his left eyebrow that hadn't been there before. I slid into the booth across from him. He pushed a pint of cheap lager toward me. I heard about the walkout, he said. He didn't look at me. He looked at the condensation on his glass. Word travels, I said. Vance is bleeding out, Julian said. He tried to run service last night. Just him and the junior cooks. The prep team didn't show up. Mateo called them all and told them what happened in the meeting. They completely boycotted. I felt a sudden, tight knot in my chest. Mateo had mobilized the kitchen. The quiet kid who just wanted to send money home had shut down a 2-star Michelin restaurant. Vance tried to cook the line, Julian continued, shaking his head. He couldn't keep up. He dropped 5 tickets in the first hour. He started screaming. He threw a pan of hot oil and it hit the expo wall. The dining room heard it. Half the guests walked out. Richard is threatening to dissolve the LLC today. I took a drink of the beer. It was cold and bitter. I didn't feel vindicated. I just felt exhausted. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Julian finally looked up. Because I've spent the last 2 years running a kitchen for a corporate steakhouse out in the suburbs. I make $100,000 a year to temp probe ribeyes and yell at teenagers. I hate my life. He leaned forward. I was an arrogant prick during the trial. I thought this industry was about stepping on people's necks to get to the top. I thought Vance was a god. But I've been watching what you did with the Bastion. You didn't just cook. You built a brigade. They walked out for you. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He slid it across the sticky table. I found an empty warehouse down by the docks, Julian said. Exposed brick. Good bones. Zoning is already approved for commercial restaurant use. The rent is dirt cheap because the neighborhood is rough. I have enough capital saved for the security deposit and the basic build-out. We buy second-hand equipment. We build the line ourselves. I stared at the paper. It was a crude floor plan drawn in blue ink. I have the money, Julian said. But I don't have a crew. And I don't have the palate. I'm a technician. You're a chef. You want to open a restaurant with me? I said. It wasn't a question. No investors, he said. No white tablecloths. No Michelin inspectors. Just 50 seats. Wood fire. Good meat. Good vegetables. We cook the food we want to eat. I looked at Julian. The perfect hair was gone. The arrogance was burned out of him. He was just a line cook looking for a home. If we do this, I said, my voice low, I run the kitchen. You run the books in the front of house. I pick the purveyors. I write the menu. Julian didn't hesitate. He nodded. Done. And one more thing, I said. I pulled my phone out of my pocket. I unlocked the screen and scrolled to my contacts. I found the number and hit dial. I put the phone on speaker and set it on the bar table. It rang 3 times. Hello, chef? A voice answered. It was quiet. It was steady. Hey, Mateo, I said. Are you currently employed? A short pause on the line. No, chef. I am currently unemployed. Good, I said. I looked right at Julian. I need a sous chef. We're building a new line. We start demo tomorrow morning. Bring your knives. Through the speaker, I heard Mateo let out a short, sharp breath. It wasn't a laugh. It was a release of pressure. Yes, chef, Mateo said. I'll be there. I hung up the phone. I slid the paper floor plan toward me and folded it into my pocket. I finished the cheap beer in one long swallow, stood up, and left Julian in the booth to pay the tab. I had a kitchen to build. We spent the first month eating drywall dust and sleeping on concrete floors. Building a restaurant from scratch when you have no credit and no corporate backing isn't romantic. It's manual labor. It's tearing out 60 years of rotting drywall, scraping black mold off brick, and pulling dead copper wire out of the ceiling until your hands cramp so badly you have to pry your fingers open. Julian's savings covered the lease and the permits. That was it. We had to scavenge the rest. We rented a U-Haul and drove out to a restaurant supply graveyard in New Jersey. It was an acre of rusted fryers, dented lowboys, and dead refrigeration units. We spent 3 days digging through the scrap. We found a 12-burner Garland commercial range that looked like it had been through a war. The pilot lines were shot, and the cast iron grates were caked in an inch of polymerized grease, but the frame was solid steel. I paid the scrap guy $800 cash for it. We hauled it back to the warehouse. Julian, the guy who used to spend 20 minutes polishing his custom Japanese slicer, spent 2 weeks on his hands and knees with a wire brush and a bucket of industrial lye, scrubbing that stove until the metal shone. He burned his knuckles raw with the chemicals. He didn't complain once. Mateo showed up on day 2 of the build-out. He didn't ask what he was getting paid. He just walked in wearing heavy work boots, picked up a sledgehammer, and started knocking down the non-load-bearing walls we needed out of the way for the open kitchen concept. Word got around the city's underbelly fast. In this industry, everyone knows everyone. A week after Mateo started swinging the hammer, my old lead grill cook from the Bastion walked through the roll-up garage door. He had a toolbox in one hand and a six-pack of cheap beer in the other. He said Richard had fired him for refusing to serve a medium-well steak that had been microwaved to save time. 2 days later, my pastry chef showed up. Then 3 of the dishwashers. We didn't hold interviews. If you showed up with calluses on your hands and you were willing to wire outlets or lay floor tile, you were on the crew. By month 3, the money was gone. We maxed out 6 different credit cards just to buy the hood ventilation system. I sold my car to pay for the first food order. I slept on a cot in the dry storage room, waking up at 4 in the morning to receive whole hogs from a local farm because we couldn't afford the premium pre-butchered cuts. We had to break down the animals ourselves on a massive maple butcher block we salvaged from a defunct butcher shop. We didn't have a PR agency. We didn't do a soft opening for food bloggers or influencers. We didn't even have a sign above the door. We just unlocked the front door on a Tuesday at 5 o'clock, turned on the neon open sign we bought at a pawn shop, and waited. The first night, we did 20 covers. Mostly industry guys. Bartenders from down the street, line cooks coming off their day shifts. We served them whole roasted pork shoulder that had been smoking over cherry wood since dawn, charred cabbage with rendered fat, and fresh pasta we rolled by hand on a steel prep table. We charged half of what the Bastion charged. The industry guys told their friends. The second night, we did 40 covers. By Friday, there was a line out the door. We didn't have a name. The city permit just said Warehouse 4B. People started calling it the Block. It was a different kind of pressure than the Bastion. At Vance's place, the pressure was artificial. It was built on ego and fear. At the Block, the pressure was pure survival. If we didn't turn the tables, the lights got shut off. But the kitchen ran like a machine gun. There was no screaming. There was no throwing pans. If a ticket got backed up, Mateo slid down the line and bailed the station out. If a cook burned a piece of fish, they threw it in the trash, called an audible to the front of the house, and fired a new one. We communicated in short, sharp bursts. Behind. Hot. Firing 2. Plating. Julian worked the front of the house. He was brilliant at it. He remembered regulars' names. He knew exactly when to comp a beer and when to politely tell a rude customer they were no longer welcome. The arrogance that made him toxic on the line made him an absolute bulldog at the host stand. Nobody pushed our waitstaff around. 6 months into the run, we were profitable. I bought a cheap mattress and moved into a studio apartment 3 blocks away. I was still working 90 hours a week, but the dull ache in my chest was gone. Mateo was running the line seamlessly. He was 20 years old and commanding guys a decade older than him with nothing but quiet competence. That was when the ghost walked in. It was a rainy Thursday night in November. The dining room was packed. The windows were completely fogged over from the heat of the wood fire and the bodies inside. The music was loud. The ticket printer was running non-stop. I was working the expo rail, wiping down rims and calling tickets. Julian came pushing through the swinging doors from the dining room. He didn't look frantic, but his jaw was locked tight. He walked right up to the pass. "Table 12, Julian said, his voice dropping below the noise of the exhaust hoods. Just sat. I didn't look up from the plate of braised short rib I was garnishing. "What about it?" "It's Arthur Vance." I stopped. I set the tweezers down on the metal rail. I wiped my hands on my towel and looked through the open kitchen window into the dining room. Table 12 was a small two-top tucked in the back corner near the exposed brick wall. Vance was sitting alone. He looked terrible. The pristine tailored suits he used to wear were gone. He was wearing a rumpled gray sweater. He had lost weight, but not in a healthy way. His skin was sallow, hanging loose around his jawline. The arrogant fire in his eyes was completely extinguished. He looked like an old man waiting for a bus in the rain. The Bastion had closed 3 weeks earlier. The news had hit the blogs like a bomb. Richard had tried to cut costs so deeply that the food became unrecognizable. The Michelin inspectors had done a surprise follow-up visit and stripped both stars in a single morning. The investors pulled their capital the next day. The doors were padlocked by the bank. Mateo stepped up to the pass next to me. He followed my eye line. He saw Vance. Mateo's left hand unconsciously drifted up to the raised pink scar on his forearm. "Chef?" Mateo asked quietly. "Do we kick him out?" I looked at the man who had built my career, terrified me, and ultimately tried to sell my soul to a real estate developer. I thought about the puddle of blood on the white tile floor. I thought about the heavy brass keys. "No," I said. "He's a paying customer." I turned back to the line. "Mateo, take over the pass." Mateo looked surprised, but he nodded. "Yes, chef." I stepped off the expo line. I walked back to the prep station. I grabbed a deep, heavy cast iron skillet. I put it on the hottest burner on the Garland range. I didn't cook him the short rib. I didn't cook him the wood-fired pork. I went into the lowboy and pulled out a mesh bag of tomatoes. I grabbed a loaf of day-old sourdough from the bread rack. I pulled a quart of chicken stock, a handful of fresh basil, and a block of Parmesan. I blistered the tomatoes in the dry cast iron until the skins cracked and blackened, filling the air with the smell of sweet, burnt sugar. I crushed them by hand into a heavy saucepan. I tore the stale bread into thick, jagged chunks and threw them into the hot pan with a massive pour of olive oil, letting them fry and soak up the fat. I drowned it in the dark, rich stock and let it boil down until it was thick, heavy, and rustic. I made him the ribollita, the peasant soup. I ladled it into a wide, shallow ceramic bowl. I hit it with a heavy glug of finishing oil and cracked black pepper. I didn't hand it to a food runner. I picked the bowl up myself and walked out from behind the line. The dining room was loud. smelling of wood smoke and roasting meat, but it felt silent to me as I walked across the concrete floor. I stopped at table 12. Vance was staring down at the raw wood of the table. He didn't look up until I set the heavy ceramic bowl down directly in front of him. The steam rose up, carrying the smell of garlic, charred tomatoes, and fat. Vance slowly raised his head. He looked at the soup. Then he looked at me. His eyes were bloodshot. "Peasant food," I said quietly. He didn't react with anger. The veins in his neck didn't bulge. He just stared at the bowl for a long time. The noise of the restaurant washed over us. Plates clattering, people laughing, the rhythmic chopping from the open kitchen. Vance picked up the heavy silver spoon. He dipped it into the thick red soup. He brought it to his mouth and tasted it. He swallowed. He closed his eyes. He sat there with his eyes closed for a full 10 seconds. I watched his shoulders drop. I watched the fight completely leave his body. He knew. In that one bite, he tasted everything he had traded away for spreadsheets and investor margins. He tasted the heart he had ripped out of his own kitchen. He opened his eyes. He didn't say a word. He didn't offer an apology, and I didn't want one. He just picked up the spoon and took another bite. I turned around and walked back to the kitchen. I didn't watch him finish. I got back on the line, bumped Mateo back to the meat station, and started calling tickets again. The rush carried us through the next 3 hours. When service finally ended, the dining room was empty. The chairs were stacked. Julian was counting out the registers at the bar. I walked out to table 12 to grab the dirty plates. The bowl was completely scraped clean. Not a single drop of broth was left. Sitting on the raw wood table next to the empty bowl was a $100 bill. Underneath it was a crumpled piece of paper. It was an old ticket from the Bastion, one of the thermal paper receipts we used to use. On the back, written in black pen, were 3 words. "Keep them alive." I looked at the note for a second. Then I folded it in half and threw it in the bus tub with the dirty silverware. I walked back into the kitchen. The stainless steel was shining. The floors were freshly mopped and smelled like bleach. The Garland stove was shut down and cooling off, ticking quietly in the back. Mateo was standing by the back door, wearing his street clothes, waiting with his backpack. He had the heavy ring of keys in his hand. I grabbed my jacket. I looked at my sous chef. "You lock up tonight, Mateo," I said. Mateo smiled. It was a real solid smile. He nodded. "Yes, chef. See you tomorrow." I walked out the back door into the cold night air. I didn't look back. I just zipped up my jacket and walked home.